Good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning. How are you? Monday morning. Uh, Hope you guys had a good Sunday. Hope y'all did some barbecuing, hanging out with the family, whatnot. Thank you for getting up with me for a Monday morning check-in. Uh, as always, if you haven't done it already, make sure you like, subscribe. If you haven't told somebody about this series, please go ahead and do that now while you still got a moment. Send somebody a text or something, tell them to tune in to Monday morning check-ins every Monday morning on YouTube, 8 a.m. We're doing it Eastern time at 7 o'clock in Texas, so you might want to set your alarm clocks a little early. As I said, we want to get your weekend started right, particularly in this age of COVID where things are a little stressful. People are trying to figure out ways to deal with the extra stress of, having to homeschool and, as we're talking about um, release, definitely people come home from prison and, just a lot going on. So I want to make sure that people are being cognizant about keeping themselves healthy, self-care, and all that good stuff. Right? So speaking of that, what new skill are you learning to make you a better organizer or an advocate or an ally? What are you doing differently than you were doing pre-COVID? For me, I think I'm definitely going back to the basics. Learning um, how to really take those same skills that I was doing in person and now translating them to a virtual environment where we're having kind of do the same work, but we're doing it in a digital type of a way. So, learning some new skills in terms of collaboration and the importance of teamwork and, you know, working outside of my bubble. Something that, as former incarcerated people, we tend to have a need to think that we should be able to do it on our own because that's how we've been doing it, but that's not necessarily the most effective way. So that's what I'm doing. Anyway, what are you doing to make yourself a better advocate, organizer, keep yourself healthy in this day and age? Um, as I said before, this is part two. We broke this down into some parts because we're going to have to go through this step by step. And as I said, we are thinking about this in a way that the first set of videos, we talked about um, which groups we should be organizing. We talked about these action groups. We talked about which strategies. And, we said that the first group was the release group. And that release group is really kind of what we're focusing on when we're focusing on advocacy in this second part, right? But we're targeting allies, organizers, advocates, and comms directors as always. And, um, efforts to reentry should always be aimed at one objective, which is advocating for access to support, services, safe, transitional, permanent housing, food, basic necessities, appropriate mental health and physical health services, of course, financial support for individuals and communities that they return to. So last week, we did an introduction to this series on advocacy, and we talked about um, how parole, probation officers, DOC, Department of Corrections, play a role in making sure folks have a successful transition. And it goes directly with the first conversation we had about the release group, right? We said that this group should include people who already have uh, the authority to access jail, prison detention, prison roster, as well as privileged and confidential information. And so we started off with the DOC having the onus of the responsibility of making sure that people have a successful reentry experience. Um, so that group was public defenders, social workers, jail, prison detention, medical staff, pretrial services, corrections, um, probation and parole. But there's also a elected executive type of targeted advocacy that we can do. When we're thinking about advocating for people, um, there's a way for us to, but we're still in the same governmental group. That's my point, is that the first two groups, the DOC and the parole probation officer, and this next group we're going to talk about is governors. So this is the state bucket of people that you can pressure or target in your advocacy with those three groups that we organized in the first talk about strategies. So as we go into this next set of conversations on governors, I want to make sure you leave comments and suggestions about what you think we should be talking about. If I'm not hitting the right notes, you think there's some stuff that I'm leaving out that you want to put in the comments. And again, thinking about women and LGBTQ folks, what about the information that I've been providing differs for groups with those types of disenfranchisement issues as well. Those folks are just as disenfranchised as on top of being formerly incarcerated, right? Folks with disabilities as well. And also thinking about folks that how much of this information needs to be translated into Spanish as well. So to make sure that we are reintegrating folks in a successful way into their communities, and not all communities are English first speaking communities, right? So, again, the theme is increasing access to justice and opportunity for people with criminal records through collaboration and partnership. We want ideas that our reentry asks are going to be directed at specific decision makers and stakeholders. This specific group, as I said, is in a governmental bracket. You can look at your release group to be the group that should be moving these people based upon our first set of videos. And we're going to talk about some of the issues on which you should be moving them. All right. Now, kind of going back to what we talked about the first time, right? When we look at releasing people in this era, I think the first thing we need to do is really concentrate on immediate access to testing and a place to quarantine with while people are waiting results for people who test positive for COVID-19, right? So that means we need to be bringing different groups together, whether it be the housing group, to make sure that housing providers, landlords, empty school dorms, whatever it is, churches, that we have places that people can get tested when they're released, particularly if they're being released from places that were considered hot spots when they released. And after those results are released, we should be facilitating a workable housing strategy, which should include coordinating with housing providers to offer individuals a safe, um, place to stay or quarantine during the pandemic, allowing people to quarantine for a 2-hour, a 2-week period prior to returning to their families. So I think it's going to be really important for us to think outside of the box when we are looking to release people and what kind of power we're asking these groups to use. So again, the first group was the DOC, the next group was the probation and parole officers. This time we're going to be talking to governors and using their executive orders. And we're going to work down the pipeline, right? We're going to ask the governors to work with probation officers on, the parole board and parole commissioners. And we're going to ask them to order blanket commutation on remaining time on parole and probation to lighten the caseloads of parole and probation officers in the community. That is one of the things that we can be doing in order to expedite release and reentry. Secondly, we want to create an emergency parole board tasked with expediting release. So I know it's kind of the horse before the cart and the cart before the horse. We want to make sure that these parole and probation officers are not overworked so they don't go to their normal first response, which is to send people back in the system. We want them to have the kind of caseload that is manageable enough where they can begin to implement some of the things that we talked about in the first round. So we want the governor to pressure the DOC to provide whatever kind of help through the parole board, because in each state that process is different, and the governors have different executive power in different states. In some states, the governor has executive authority to just commute these sentences, and in those states, you want to be pressuring the governor to do so. In other states where the governor has to rely on a parole board as an approval kind of process, then we want to make sure that he creates an emergency parole board that is tasked with expediting the release of people, but also kind of pushing down these directives to the parole and probation officers that their main onus of work should be about providing resources and services, right? And we want the governor to really take the leadership in this. Secondly, we want the governor to provide funding to ensure that people returning to community have phone and internet access. Thinking about the community group and thinking about where we fit in this cycle, what role are we playing? Providing people who do not have functioning cell phones or prepaid phones and chargers so they can make living arrangements and contact probation officers where those check-ins haven't been suspended, doctors and family visits and friends. The governor should provide funding to the appropriate agency best suited to distribute these phones. There are many creative ways for us to provide people access to smartphones. We also need to provide folks access to computers and internet for people who are released so they can make living arrangement, transact business, and apply for public benefits. They also, this could be done by offering internet computer access in clean spaces where people can go use the internet, but also socially distance. So when we're thinking about that first ask about providing a place for people to quarantine after release during that testing phase, we're also making sure that the governor provides adequate funding to people have access to a phone and internet. In this time period, it's going to be, instrumental that folks have access to the internet, folks have access to phones at the very least. And we want to make sure the governor is leading on that. Um, Secondly, or thirdly, I should say, we want to make sure that the governor is supporting existing reentry transitional service organizations. Um, those folks who are already doing the work, we want to make sure that they maintain their funding. We want to make sure that um, politics doesn't become one of the issues that stops people from being funded. We know that there are bills happening across, in different jurisdictions where people's funding are in jeopardy based upon a piece of legislation that's trying to impact the way time credits are being used. But in that bill, we're also cutting the funding. So we need to be careful and pressuring the governor and make sure that they expand funding and reduce barriers to accessing funding for these organizations, especially those that are run of former incarcerated people, right? Want to make sure that those organizations are always well funded, peer support and mentoring organizations, mental health and substance abuse providers. Those organizations need to definitely maintain their funding. As we think about those groups we talked about, those housing groups in that community group, I think this would fall under who would be pressuring the governor to do this work. Again, we want to use the strategies to take these tactics. And one of the tactics is to pressure them to, on a legislative basis, to maintain pressure on the governor to keep the funding in place, right? Now, most cities, counties, and states have existing organizations dedicated to assisting former incarcerated individuals. Those organizations are often extremely knowledgeable about how to facilitate successful reentry, and yet they're severely under-resourced and underfunded. Organizations that are led by directly impacted people or people of color should receive priority funding, resources, and support. Now, we should also direct additional funding and resources to those organizations so that they can carry out the work on a greater scale now and beyond this COVID era. And ask those organizations for input on what services you need to prioritize the help that people need when returning to the community after incarceration. So, whichever group you belong to, think about that as we're looking to pressure the governor in different ways with different groups and different strategies to get what we need, which is a successful reentry strategy for people coming home from jails, prisons, and detention centers. So fourth in line there is we want to make sure that we direct funding to housing providers. That's going to be important. And, folks are facing evictions. People aren't able to maintain their homes. Uh, when you got a loved one coming home from prison, it becomes even more important for us to pressure the governor to be creative and think about ways that they can help people transition and the community not bear the complete onus of providing housing opportunities. So we want to coordinate with a variety of housing providers, including public housing agencies, private housing management companies, landlords, motels, educational institutions, with housing and other potential housing providers to create safe and free options for people who are leaving jails, prisons, and detention centers. We want to ensure that these include options for accessible for people with disabilities. Now, when we think about also in this era of COVID, there are immigration implications as well. And for those populations that are concerned about ICE surveillance, we want to make sure to consider alternative suggestions to keep people safe. A stop evictions proceeding during this pandemic is absolutely mandatory and humane, and it's the only human thing to do. Folks shouldn't be evicted during um, not only a recession, but a complete pandemic where people's lives are in danger from just being in the same room with folks. So that's the least we can do. And speaking of healthcare, right? We want to make sure governors are enabling easy access to healthcare. Um, if you have a pre-existing condition, as we talked about in the first video, those pre-existing conditions means that the Department of Corrections should be providing folks with access to bridge amount of medications. What I mean by bridge is the time that they leave incarceration to when they're able to see a doctor. We want to make sure that governors require expedited placement and presumptive eligibility of recently released individuals on Medicare, Medicaid, and other health insurance that enables them to seek medical assistance and have access to telecommunications with health providers. You know, as I said before, when I came home from prison, I didn't have access to health care. It wasn't until I got a job with an organization that offered health care that I had a health care plan. Up until that point, you know, I was going, you know, I would tell people that the ER doctor was my general practitioner. So we want to make sure that folks have access to regular doctor visits, um, particularly if they're coming from environments that were potentially infected with COVID. We want to require and facilitate expedited processing and resuming of SSI and SSDI benefits for people with disabilities who are returning to their communities. We want to make sure that we're signing people up for health care that can be done just as or before they leave detention facilities, jails, or prisons. We want to make that sign-up process as easy as possible. We want to create easy phone or online sign-up opportunities, and we want to implement telehealth coordination with community service providers. This is the kind of pressure we want to be putting on the governor. We want to make sure the governor is coordinating with healthcare providers at the highest levels possible to make that transition in this time period and beyond, but particularly during this pandemic, that folks have access to healthcare, and that help is coming at the Department of Corrections level. So, go to the next slide. Talking about enabling access to food and financial assistance. You know, we want to make sure the governor is requiring and facilitating expedited opening of public benefit cases for people returning to the community, particularly in the case of food stamps and cash assistance. You know, that should be offered immediately so that people can survive during this crisis. As soon as folks are released, they should have immediate access to food stamps and some type of financial assistance. And you've often heard me say that when I came home from prison, I came home with a bus ticket of $50. And that $50 was expected. I was expected to find housing, clothing, travel, and, you know, with $50. So we need to be thinking not just short term, but long term about providing folks financial assistance when they leave incarceration. We want to make that sign up process as easy as possible. We want to create easy phone or online sign up opportunities. You know, we can pressure the governor in different ways, but the more we think about those first groups we talked about, the community group, the release group, each of those groups have different levers that they can use on the governor when we're advocating. So just thinking about ways that those groups can advocate the good governor to do, to move and use his executive authority Fourthly, we want to lift restrictions on people with open criminal cases and criminal histories. We want governors to use their executive authority to lift restrictions on access to housing, employment, public benefits, and healthcare for people with pending criminal cases or criminal convictions so that people can reintegrate back into the community and society without obstacles, not just during the COVID era, but moving forward. When folks are coming home from bail or being able to make bond or having spent the last 6, 7 months in jail awaiting a trial, they come home with nothing. They may have lost their jobs, may have lost their children, their homes. So we need to be lifting restrictions on these people when it comes to housing. Next, on that same link, you can see here on the slide, we need to waive enforcement of all legal systems or law enforcement agency costs, fines, fees, and obligations. We need to suspend statutes and regulations authorizing state and local jurisdictions and counts to assess, collect fees, fines, and costs. That needs to cease immediately, and the governor has the power to do that. We need the governor to order state taxing authorities and other relevant state collection agencies to stop attachment, garnishments, levies, and liens for unpaid court, detention, or supervision costs, fines, and fees. A lot of times when you owe for a court fee, you begin to pay more on the interest that they're charging you on the fact that you owed than the actual fine that the surcharges is what they call them. You end up paying more surcharges than you actually do for the fine and the fee. And that's because these agencies support their budget by doing this. So we need to rethink the way these budgets are allocated, and we need the governor to think beyond, the way that we've normally done things in funding these agencies and think outside the box. So we want to suspend all interest accrual, financial penalties, and other legal system consequences for non-payment of late payment of costs, fines, and fees. We want to prohibit private agencies from collecting unpaid costs, fines, and fees. And we want to encourage the governor to waive or suspend all outstanding costs, fines, and fees, obligations, and interest directly related to an open court case, closed court case, parole, probation, fees as well. So again, we want the governor to be active in reducing or creating successful integration back in a community and going back to the strategy groups. And those strategy groups, the housing release group and the community group, each of those groups are able to speak to that specific issue in a different way. So when y'all work these groups out and y'all decide which groups are most effective, you really have a way to attack the governor with different strategic and substantive tactics, but you're pressuring him in a way that overall, if he isn't able to get the help of the legislator, then he can use his executive authority, which is really what we want him to do anyway. So anyway, the next step, we want to mandate the collection and distribution of data relating to release and process. The reason why this is important is that we want to get a sense of how successful our actions are. We want to begin to get a data collection, a data set of just how successful people are reintegrating based upon the release methods. If we're going to release these tons of people, then we need to get tons of information, or at least contact tracing. How are these people doing in terms of employment? How they're doing in terms of housing? How they're doing in terms of their healthcare? How they're doing in terms of their community reintegration? And then on that other end of it, we need to be getting information from the families. We need to be getting information from the service providers. We need to get that A/B set data set of information, and the governor needs to make this mandated. Upon release, processing while they're on at least for the first 90 to 180 days. We need to be thinking about that data set to make sure the governor and his staff is pushing to push parole probation officers in the Department of Corrections to institute a mechanism to mandate and collect that data. That is going to be mandatory. Finally, and I appreciate you guys working with me through these slides, is we want to facilitate access to medical providers. You know, again, not just because it's COVID, but overall, you know, when people come home from prison, jails, and institutions, they're usually coming home in a worse state than they went in. So based upon that data we talked about earlier, we want to make sure that we're keeping track of people's health, people's access to health, and the community group can be part of that group that helps does that, as well as the release group. The release group, as we said, should contain people who have direct access to the prison roster, if you will, and medical staff is part of those people, social workers, jail, prison, and detention staff. So if you are part of these groups, you should really be pressuring the governor to make sure that we have access to medical providers, you know, easy access to SSI, SSDI for disability, and some kind of healthcare vouchers. And next week we'll talk about how county agencies can work in coordination with this process as well. All right, man, I really, really appreciate you guys tuning in. If you have a moment, make sure you like, subscribe. Reentry Matters. You can find me on all my platforms, Twitter. I think I'm on TikTok now, and I'm on Instagram, Louis Conway Jr. Look below. We've got lots of resources. I'm going to keep trying to add more resources to the Google Drive. So you guys can share these slides out, use these slides as need be. All right, have a good one. Thank you so much. Have a blessed rest of your week.